14.2 Constructors. Before we jump into constructors, though, I know you're wondering how come we didn't have a unit on instance variables. Well, it's because instance variables and constructors are related. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the construction of this object but using the instance variables. So before we start with constructors, we're going to say, what do we need? Now, I'm going to make this simple. So I'm not going to put all the information that goes into a regular bank account. No, no, no. I'm going to keep this pretty straightforward. Now, if we're building a real bank account, we'll need things like the person's first name, last name, middle initial or middle name, social security number, their balance, their address, their phone number, their email, and the list could go on and on and on. Okay, we need a lot of data to create the bank account, but we're going to keep this simple. So I'm going to create a few pieces of information to store in this class, encapsulate. What I'm going to do first is it's going to be a string and I'm going to hold their name. I'm also going to hold their phone number as a string. That's two pieces of information. One more piece. I'm going to hold as a double their balance. That's important. If you're going to have a bank account, you do need a balance. It needs to be a double because there's going to be cents involved. Right? So we're going to need that. Okay, so now that we have these three pieces of information, those are going to be our instance variables, and that's what we need to create this bank account class. Okay, so just those three pieces of information. Moving on to constructors. Now, I'm going to create two constructors. So the reason why I'm creating two, it's because it's generally good to create what is known as a default constructor and a non-default. So I'm going to write these instance variables. So if you're making a class, you have to, before you begin, to figure out what I'm going to need. So you gather your data first. Then you figure about the construction of this information. So constructors. A constructor is simply the name of the class, okay? The word public in front of it, but not the word class. So you could literally just copy this up here. Be careful though, be very careful. Delete the word class, put parentheses around this, and open and close a curly. That's a constructor. Realize the constructor doesn't have a return type like a method. So, okay, we're not going to return something. Even not even void can go there. This constructor that I created is now the default constructor. Why is it called default? Because there are no parameters. No parameters. Doesn't take in a value. Okay. Then we go to the other constructor called a non-default constructor. So I'm about to do this again, but this time we're gonna have parameters. Now realize I can't do this default constructor twice. It's throwing an error. It's saying, hey, you already did this. You have a duplication of your code. See that? Duplicate. So I'm not going to do it again as a default. Instead, I'm going to take in the values that's going to set these, which brings me to a very important point. The purpose of a constructor is to give these instance variable a starting value, an initial value. So our job for a constructor, then, that's why I don't have a unit for instance variables, because they're tied together. First you figure out what you need and you figure out how to start them off with a value. So I'm going to take in these values, string name. I'm going to take in a string phone number, and I'm going to take in a double balance. So now I have two types of constructors. I have a default and a non-default constructor. This is very common, okay? So default and non-default. Not that you need them, but they're extremely common. So that's why I'm showing you both. Okay. First, default values for these go in here, and the non-default values go in here. So the first one I'm going to do is the default. Now, you have to know these. These are all part of the actual basic understanding of computing is that the values that are in these in memory in RAM has a default value. You can't just say it's nothing. You can't say, okay, wait, no, my name is nothing. Okay, nothing doesn't exist. We have to find a way to express nothing based on the type. If it's an object, it's null. So name currently is null. That if I didn't actually type this, it would still do it for me. But I'm showing you because I want to make sure you get every single piece of this, okay? The phone number also is a string. It's null. If this was a button or a label or any type of object, those two would all be null. Now, double. What is the default value for double? Well, the default value is 0.0. Realize I'm setting these values by knowing the default for these variables. If it were a Boolean, it would be false. Why false? Because 0 represents false and 1 represents true. Remember, computers are all about bits. 0 for false, 1 for true. So clearly, if it's a Boolean and I didn't give it a value, it's going to go to what's considered nothing. Nothing is 0 and 0 is false. If it was an integer, it would have been 0. See, can't say nothing. So in integer world, the 0 represents nothing. In doubles, it's 0.0. If it's an object, it's null. And if it's Boolean, it's false. Now we come to the non-default constructor. Now we want to set these values, the blue one, to the brown one. These are known as dummy variables. What it means is when the person creates a bank account using this non-default constructor, they're going to put actual values here. Okay, they're going to put Lake and put the actual phone number and put the actual balance. And then our job now is to pass this information from these dummy variables, these guys who hold in them very temporarily, to the guys up here. So these are known as pass by value. I'm passing this name to this name. Now be very careful. Realize that the name here is brown. The name here is blue. These two are not the same. This is a local one called a dummy. This is a global one. Okay, so let's make sure we put that up here and this is global. So we want to pass them over. Look at this carefully. Be careful here. This is incorrect. It's incorrect because you could see that they're both brown. So in essence, I'm passing the dummy to itself. But that's silly because this doesn't get updated. So what's going to happen when the person makes this? These are going to still all be default because they never got set. So whenever you have dummy variables and they're the same names as the instance variables, the way to differentiate them is to use the word this. See the color change? Pay attention to that. You see the guy on the left is blue and the one on the right is brown. Be careful. The right is the dummy. The left is the instance variable. Okay, this is how we're setting them. So of course we're going to set this dot phone number. And we're going to set that to the phone number, the dummy one. And then the last one is this dot balance. And we're going to set that to the balance, the dummy one. So when they create an instance of the class using this, they're going to actually give me a name. I'm going to set it to this. They're going to give me a phone number. I'm going to set it to this. They're going to give me a balance, and I'm going to set it to that. What happens after this code runs? All three of these are cleared from memory. Gone. Okay? Gone. Completely gone. These are still around because these are global. These lifespans longer. These lifespans short. These guys only live in this scope. Okay? Let that sink in there. Scope. These three live right in here. So once we reach this end and this code is over, these guys are nowhere to be found. So this is only a big deal if their names are the same. Now let's say this was N. I could just say N here, and I don't need the this. Because they're different, okay? The computer can distinguish between the dummy and the instance. But once the names are the same, and we tend to generally keep the names the same, you use this, okay? Now, this is how we make constructors. We literally have a default, And a non-default, we could make more. I mean, every class we could have many of these, but these are the basics starting out, okay? How to make a default one and how to make a non-default one. How do you pass information? Like I said, we're going to talk about them in depth, so we're going to pass information around. A constructor's job is to initialize these guys, to start them off with a value. Now, here's the thing. That doesn't mean they can't change while the app's running. They can, but when we start out, these are going to be their values to start. So for example, if they make a bank account and it's $500 to start, it's going to set it to $500. Doesn't mean the person can deposit money later. Hear that method? That's coming up next. That doesn't mean the person can deposit some money later and change the balance. But when we start out, we'll have the original amounts and the original name and phone number and so on and so forth. Person gets married and want to change their name, they change their name. The person wants to change their phone number, come back into the bank, we could change their phone number. So although we're starting here, that's not necessarily how it's going to stay for the rest of the app. Okay, but this is just the initialization. So variables and constructors, they're linked. Okay, these guys are what we need to make the app, and this guy starts them off. Okay, that brings us to the end of 14.2.